Bon matin.
Good morning.
Call the meeting to order. Bienvenue, chers collègues.
Welcome, colleagues. Welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for being here today to help us understand the different departments.
On environment and sustainable development. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format and is televised. For those in person, please follow the health and safety guidelines for using earpieces written on the cards on the table. The QR code on the card links to a short awareness video. Substitutions today we have for Mr. Grant Wade, Will Greaves, and for Mr. David Bext, we have Jason Girolo. Welcome. And also I'd like to take the moment to wish happy birthday to one of the ladies that are in front of me. And for you, the department has brought in a big, beautiful purple cake. I guess that's your favorite color. So all the best. I won't ask your age. But happy birthday, joyeux fête, and 100 more. So today, the committee is meeting with officials from Environment and Climate Change Canada for a briefing on the department's mandate and activities and the legislation it administers. Les témoins aujourd'hui sont Linda Drainville.
Today, our witnesses are Linda Drainville, Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Financial Officer, Corporate Services and Financial Management Branch. Alison McDermott, Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy and International Affairs Branch. Megan Nichols, Assistant Deputy Minister, Environmental Protection Branch. And Tara Shannon, Assistant Deputy Minister, Canadian Wildlife Service.
To opening remarks and questioning witnesses. We will follow the committee's routine motion for the time provided for questioning witnesses. We will start with the Conservative Party for 6 minutes. And we will now proceed with opening remarks from our guests.
Can you hear me? Good sound? Vous pouvez m'entendre? Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Merci de l'invitation.
Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. It is a privilege to provide an overview of the work and priorities of Environment and Climate Change Canada, or ECCC. Our mission is simple but is essential. Our mandate is to preserve and enhance the quality of the natural environment for present and future generations.
By the Department of the Environment Act, which gives the Minister responsibilities ranging from protecting air, water, and soil quality, managing migratory birds, to coordinating government-wide policies on the environment. The Minister also has key responsibilities under several cornerstone laws. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act helps prevent pollution and manage risks to human health and the environment. The Species at Risk Act protects wildlife in danger of disappearing. The Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act establishes carbon pricing across Canada, creating incentives to cut emissions. And the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act requires the government to set and report on targets that will get Canada to net zero emissions by 2050. These laws are not abstract. They provide the framework for how Canada addresses today's most pressing environmental issues. They give us the tools to protect biodiversity, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve air and water quality, and prepare for a changing climate. But no single government can meet these challenges alone. Protecting the environment is a matter of shared jurisdiction under the Constitution. That means effective action depends on close collaboration with provinces, territories, municipalities, Indigenous peoples, and international partners. Sur le plan national, nous travaillons.
Domestically, we work bilaterally and multilaterally with provinces and territories, including through the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment and the Ministers for Conservation, Wildlife, and Biodiversity. We also maintain distinctions-based tables with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners. We are advancing commitments under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Internationally, Canada plays an active role in global environmental and climate negotiations, from the Paris Agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity.
With allies on issues such as plastic pollution, clean trade, and transboundary water management. Our work spans 4 key areas. We regulate emissions reductions, design and implement carbon pricing, and work with provinces, territories, Indigenous partners, and industry to support Canada's climate objectives. Our department leads on climate science, modeling, and adaptation planning, helping governments, communities, and businesses prepare for more frequent floods, wildfires, heat waves, and storms. We monitor air, water, and soil quality, regulate toxic substances, and manage environmental emergencies. We enforce compliance under SEPA and the pollution prevention provisions of the Fisheries Act, and we support safe management of waste, plastics, and hazardous materials. We safeguard species at risk, protect migratory birds, and manage national wildlife areas. We are advancing work to conserve 30% of Canada's land and waters by 2030, in line with the Could Make Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And through the Meteorological Service of Canada, we provide 24/7 forecasts and alerts that millions of Canadians rely on daily. These services are essential to public safety, economic activity, and Canada's sovereignty in the north. Across all of these areas, our approach is grounded in science, informed by Indigenous knowledge, and strengthened through partnerships. We also recognize the broader context. Environmental protection is not only about avoiding harm, but about positioning Canada for long-term economic and social resilience. In short, Environment and Climate Change Canada is a science-based department with a broad and complex mandate. We administer a suite of legislative tools, deliver critical services, and work across jurisdictions to address issues that touch the daily lives of Canadians, whether it is the air we breathe, the water we drink, the weather we prepare for, or the climate we leave to our children. Mr. Chair, members, I hope this overview helps set the stage for your study. We would be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. McDermott. Who would be next?
I think, Mr. Chair, we did not prepare to be next. So
There'd be one person speaking for all. Thank you. Okay. We will start now with the questions. Mr. Ross, you're up first, and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today in front of this committee. And I listened to the opening remarks, and I just want to know, does your ministries actually engage with international ministries as well in terms of environmental assessments?
I mean, the quick answer is yes, we do. If you'd like a more detailed answer with respect to environmental assessment.
No, that's okay. That's fine. That's good. Yes is good enough. So there's an issue that's been brewing in BC now for the last 10 years at least, and that's a transboundary issue. And essentially what it's talking about is First Nations Alaska demand to be consulted on mining projects and environmental assessments that may affect Alaskan boundaries. I notice Canada is absent. Does Canada plan to be part of this transboundary dispute, or do they have a position? Because it does boil down to an international dispute.
We'll turn to Michael Bonser,
Okay.
ADM for International.
Sir, thank you for the question. My name is Michael Bonser. I'm the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy, International Affairs. I'm sorry, by moving here, I've probably eaten into your 6 minutes. The short answer is we have a very robust approach to dealing with transboundary issues, including, especially with the United States, and it involves provinces, states, Indigenous peoples. It is based around our work through the ICJ, as you probably know as well. I will take back this very specifics around this question, and we can come back to the committee with a stronger and more complete answer as to the question and the sense that Canada is absent from this. That is not something that I had understood, but if I will go back to the department and my team, and we'll come back to the committee with more information.
A written response would be excellent. Thank you. Back to my questions. There's lots of talk about an oil pipeline being built to the West Coast. Has your department or your departments talked to Prince Rupert, Kitimat, surrounding communities about an oil pipeline being built to the BC coast? Or will it be predicated on a project being officially registered with the Canadian environmental government?
Thank you for the question. Environment and Climate Change Canada has not at this time been involved in such discussions. We would not necessarily be the first department involved in a decision on such a pipeline. Natural Resources Canada is usually the lead department for such initiatives. And then there's also the new Major Projects Office that will be taking a lead in any new nation building projects.
Thank you for that. Is there any type of interaction or relationship that is contemplated or in writing in terms of your departments and the Major Projects Office? How will the two entities work together?
At this point, the Major Projects Office has just been announced to have been created very recently, as I'm sure the committee is aware. So at this point, it is still being stood up, and we will be ready to participate and engage as soon as that invitation is extended. And leading up to the creation of the office, there has certainly been lots of engagement across departments, and we'll continue to participate in those fora.
In the announcement of the Major Projects Office, it mentioned that it will maintain robust environmental standards, but I don't understand how that's going to be maintained or created without direct interaction with departments such as your own and the relevant ministries. So is it my understanding there's been no discussion on the relationship between the Major Projects Office and your departments?
Certainly, there has been discussion at officials level. I was just simply explaining that because the office has only just been announced, there has not yet been a great deal of formal engagement. However, our expectation is certainly that there will be robust engagement. That has been the expectation all along and what's certainly been communicated to us. In terms of robust environmental decisions, the New Building Canada Act really changes the focus of decisions on projects from whether projects will be built to the how they would be built if they are designated as such under this new act. And responsible ministers, such as the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, will have a role in recommending the conditions for a project's approval to the minister responsible for the new act. So we're confident that we will have a robust role in advising on those conditions.
So it sounds like your departments will be there in a recommendation role and advisement only. There's been no official talk about how you do it at a legal or regulatory standpoint, nothing in writing. So nothing's really been formally decided upon or created to ensure that your departments and your jobs and your duties to uphold environmental standards, nothing has been put in writing to ensure that happens with the Major Projects Office?
Well, there is the Building Canada Act itself.
I understand that. I'm talking about at a lower level. I'm not talking about the announcements. I'm not talking about the political stuff. I'm talking about the real work that gets done at your level. Has nothing been formalized to ensure the environmental standards are upheld in relation to what you do to protect the environment versus what the Major Progress Office has nothing formally been decided upon yet.
There have been many discussions at the working level, but nothing officially formalized at this time.
Thank you.
That's-
Mr. Ross, that's it. Time is up. I've given you extra minute, extra. Yes, I did.
The guy took time to get to that.
Yes, that's why I gave you extra. I didn't want to cut you before your question, so
Okay.
I was giving her time to respond. Thank you. Next, it's over to who's going first? Eric and Mr. Saint-Pierre?
Yes, thank you.
Just if you're sharing your time, si vous partagez votre... Monsieur Bonnet, vous, dans votre cas, vous partagez.
Mr. Bonnet, of course, you won't be sharing your time, but if you are planning to share your time, please state who you're going to share your time with before beginning. Thank you. Yes, perfect. So I'll be sharing my time with my colleague.
McDermott, and thank you all for the wonderful work that you do. You mentioned that no single government can meet these challenges alone. Protecting the environment is a matter of shared jurisdiction. Can you comment further on the role of provinces in meeting Canada's NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and also comment on whether Quebec is meeting those challenges?
Yes, that's absolutely right, that environment is very much a shared area of jurisdiction, and a lot of the levers rest with provincial and even municipal governments. So Canada's emissions reduction plan includes participation from all the provinces and territories, and we have a number of mechanisms to collaborate with those provinces and territories. Meetings of the Ministers of Environment happen every year, and we have a lot of regulatory cooperation and cooperation with respect to management of pollution pricing, for example.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us here today. I'd also like to hear about cooperation with municipalities. Municipalities are, I suppose, a creation of provinces, but they are where a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions are sourced, where millions of Canadians live, and how the department works directly with municipalities to help us meet our objectives.
Sure. Well, there's many examples where we first of all, we do strive to respect constitutional jurisdictions, and we work in most cases through provinces, but we do have some programs that are directly made available to municipalities, programs like the Green Municipal Funds, which support like a range of actions and investments to reduce greenhouse gases and prepare Canada to be ready for Canada's changing climate. So there are a number of programs in our emissions reduction plan and our national adaptation strategy. If more details are required, we'd be happy to provide some more examples.
Thank you. Mrs. Miedema?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm curious, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the new kind of division of responsibilities now that we have a Secretary of State for Nature. Minister Thompson is now the Minister of Fisheries and not Fisheries and Oceans. And I'm particularly curious about the Species at Risk Act. So, for example, is DFO responsible for endangered ocean species, or does that rest wholly with ECCC?
Thank you for the question. So currently with the Secretary of State for Nature, she's actually cross-appointed to 4 different ministers who have a role in delivering on the nature agenda. With respect to the Species at Risk Act, currently the responsibilities for the Act rest with the Minister of Environment for terrestrial species. Aquatic species are the responsibility of the Minister of Fisheries. There is a close collaboration between those 2 ministers on the implementation of the Act, but that is more or less how the Act is distributed.
Thank you, Mrs. Shannon. Monsieur Saint-Pierre?
Yes, Mrs. McDermott, during your presentation, you mentioned the regulation of emissions reductions, design and implementing carbon pricing. Can you comment a little bit on whether that includes some of the work around industrial carbon price? And are you able to comment on whether the output-based pricing system or industrial carbon price regulation is forthcoming? Can you comment on industrial carbon price, please?
Turn that over to my colleague, Megan.
Thanks very much. Certainly, this does include our work on carbon pricing. When the government removed the federal fuel charge back in March, it did announce that we would be renewing our focus on industrial carbon pricing as one of the key pillars to achieving our climate goals, and that we would be engaging with provinces and territories and industry on how to strengthen that system and making sure that it's working as effectively as possible.
I'd like to, speaking of carbon pricing, this is not necessarily widely understood, but the purpose of carbon pricing isn't to pay it; it's to avoid it. I'd like to know what we are doing to work with industry to help, innovate, persuade. So that ultimately we are both reducing emissions and improving bottom lines by avoiding unnecessary costs like carbon pricing.
A short answer, please.
Certainly. Indeed, the intent of carbon pricing is to keep costs low for regulatees and to provide them with maximum flexibility on how to comply, but also to drive investment and in decarbonization. So there are three ways a company can comply. They can reduce their emissions so that they are below the required limit. They can purchase credits, or they can pay the price directly to government. So it's purposely designed to have a lot of flexibility to encourage the kind of innovation that you're mentioning.
Thank you, Mrs. Nichols. Monsieur Bonnet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Juste préciser, finalement.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to specify that my colleague, Mr. Lemire, will be replacing me halfway through. I'm afraid I can't stay for the entire meeting. First question, ever since Mr. Carney came into his position, there have been some steps backwards when it comes to protecting the environment. Can you give us an idea of the status of the plan of action for reducing greenhouse gases? Where are we when it comes to our targets for 2030 and 2050, and what are the impacts of those steps backward? I will start by mentioning that the government made many great strides forward when it comes to decarbonization. There are several programs and fundamental policies like carbon pricing and other regulations such as tax credits for investments and many policies to help businesses and Canadians reduce their emissions. Yes, but my question is, what is the impact of these steps backwards by the government? Well, if I answer that question directly, the Prime Minister has already reaffirmed his commitment to fight climate change and reach net zero by 2050. He considers that climate change is not only a moral imperative, but also an economic imperative. The world is evolving. I'm sorry, we have very little time. My question was not what did Mr. Carney say, but what is the impact of the changes that Mr. Carney brought ever since he came into his position? in relation to the 2030 and 2050 targets. When it comes to the carbon tax for consumers, we believe that it had a limited effect. It may reduce reduction by 1 to 2% compared to 2005 levels. Can you give us an answer in megatons? When it comes to carbon pricing for consumers, I believe it's 3 megatons in 2030. I think that the estimates vary a little bit when it comes to the model that's used. Question inaudible.
La réglementation.
And when it comes to the Zero Emissions Act, that has been pushed forward.
The target in 2026. The impact has not yet been calculated, given that the government has also announced its intent to review that regulation in more detail to make sure that industry will continue to be able to achieve the goals and also that prices for consumers are affordable. So we are currently conducting a 60-day review of the full regulation, and at the end of that time, once we finalize potential changes, we will be able to assess the full impact of all changes, including the removal of the 2026 target.
Monsieur Carney a plusieurs reprises.
Several times, Mr. Carney refused to reiterate his commitment towards the targets set for 2030. Aside from Mr. Trump, do you know of any other country that has signed the Paris Agreement that is backing down on those targets? And do you know if the Paris Agreement allows countries to reduce their targets, their ambition? And does the Net Zero Act allow Canada to do what it stated it would do? The international regulations were not created to make it easy for countries to back down on their ambitions. They were really created so that countries think big, so they weren't created to allow for countries to back down. But are there any other countries aside from the U.S. that plan to back down on those targets? And in the agreement, is it allowed? Are countries allowed to reduce their targets? Briefly, please. In the agreement, there is nothing about allowing nations to reduce their targets. Thank you.
Mrs. Anstey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask some questions around an industry that is extremely important to the province that I come from in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's the offshore oil and gas sector. Given that we have a new government with new objectives, I want to discuss more specifically how this sector relates to trade diversification, but also within that context, the impact that the emissions cap has on investor certainty. Firstly, given the Prime Minister's clear mandate to diversify Canada's trade and the fact that the offshore oil in Newfoundland and Labrador is one of the few resources with direct access to tidewater, I'm just curious if the witnesses might agree or disagree that this sector could be an important part of the Prime Minister's mandate.
Certainly, thank you. I can start, and if my colleague wants to add. Certainly, the government has recognized the importance of Canada leveraging its energy resources to be an energy superpower in both conventional and clean energies, and is committed to leveraging that advantage that we have. In terms of the emissions cap, which you mentioned, indeed, draft regulations for that were published back in fall 2024. We received significant feedback from provinces and territories and stakeholders on this proposal, and so we are considering the way forward based on all of that. Certainly, the cap is not meant to be a cap on production. It's only meant to be on emissions, and so the draft regulations were carefully designed to ensure that they would not have a significant impact on the potential growth of the sector.
Thank you. Interesting that you point out about it not being a cap on production, because industry reports a 60% drop in offshore capital spending since 2016, 0 exploration wells in 2025. So it's interesting that you would say there's no cap on production when currently we're seeing that there is a big drop. So I'm just curious how you square that with the regulatory framework, and wondering what your position is with respect to this potentially causing a negative impact on that industry.
I can only really speak to the Environment Canada role, which is really limited to that regulatory function. So I can't speak to what other factors might be that are affecting investment in the offshore sector. But again, I would just say that we did receive significant feedback from provinces and from industry, and so are taking that into consideration in determining the way forward on this particular proposal.
Yeah, and keep in mind that the cap is not in place at this point in time.
And again, just to this point, once again, other offshore jurisdictions like Norway and Brazil are attracting billions in new investment. Now, the government has introduced this new legislation, Bill C-5, the National Projects List, which, you know, our understanding of it all is that it's clearly designed to streamline major infrastructure projects and to reduce the regulatory burden. Can you acknowledge that this legislation was intended to address the regulatory hurdles that, you know, currently are driving this investment from places like Newfoundland and Labrador into other areas like Norway and Brazil? What's your position on that?
1 minute to go.
I can't speak to the extent to which, you know, any changes in investment patterns may be directly due to regulatory suite, but certainly Bill C-5 is intended to streamline regulatory processes so that rather than a project having to seek approvals from many departments, they are combined in one document and provided upfront, subject to conditions that would be then enforced by individual departments.
So given that it's streamlined, then it would acknowledge that up until this point, the regulatory burden would have caused delays and bottlenecks.
I can't pronounce myself on that cause and effect.
Currently, there are media reports, and the industry is watching this very closely, that there might be some walking back on the proposed oil and gas emissions cap and replacing it with some investment-based measures. So do you feel that this policy that you referred to earlier would have been an effective policy, or can you just speak to that, given that we're hearing some rumblings that they may be walking back on this?
Thank you. A short answer, please.
I would just say that certainly it's always important to consider a range of policy measures in terms of emissions reductions. Oil and gas is the highest emitting sector in the Canadian economy, and some subsectors are growing. So certainly one we need to continue to focus on.
Thank you, Mrs. Nichols. Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
Oui, puis je vais peut-être partager mon temps aussi avec mes collègues.
Thank you, and I may share my time with my colleagues. I have a question on the conservation file. I know that there are targets under the Aichi targets. I'd like to know if you can give us an update on what you've achieved up to now when it comes to conservation. Yes. We're now at 13.8% of protected areas.
Towards the 30% by 2030. That's terrestrial. The aquatic is closer to, it is over 15%. And my apologies, I don't have the exact number in front of me at the moment. So there's a lot of work to still continue to do. I think that really important to acknowledge that in the context of meeting the target, we have to work very closely with our provincial territorial colleagues who are responsible for the administration of 76% of Canada's lands. Only 6% of Canada's territory falls under federal jurisdiction, so it's an area of distinct partnership with our PT colleagues. Thank you.
Maybe a quick follow-up question, then pass it on to my colleagues. Mais curieux, est-ce que vous avez mis en place?
I'm curious to know, have you set up any initiatives for conservation in the years to come, and can you comment on some of those initiatives? There are several.
Actually, existing nature agreements with our provincial and territorial partners. We have 5 in place and a 6th one under consideration with the province of Manitoba. I think I would highlight in particular the work also that is underway with respect to the nature agreement with the province of British Columbia, which is actually a trilateral agreement between Canada, British Columbia, and the Indigenous nations in the province. So that is an umbrella initiative with many other sub-projects that will be proceeding as defined by a trilateral governance committee.
I'm wondering if you can update on what I think was maybe the work to create a federal strategy around insured and uninsured losses based on extreme weather events across the country. I know I had been speaking in my past life with the City of Halifax about like with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and they have their event every fall, Climate Proof Canada, where they come, and I know that they have been speaking directly with your department as well as others. Just wondering where that sits now.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Excellent question. I'm sorry that this is a bit of a shared file between Public Safety and Environment Canada, so I think we would be better to come back with a written answer to that question about an update on where we stand.
This may also be a bit of a shared file. I want to hear what the government is doing, anticipates doing with respect to adaptation and mitigation. We had serious droughts across the country this year, affecting agriculture. Wildfires are becoming a permanent part of summer and even spring in the country. It's affecting air quality. What is ECCC planning to help Canadians address these issues?
40 seconds.
Well, the Department of Environment is actually working across the federal government with a long series of other departments in its implementing its national adaptation strategy. To date, the government has invested more than $6.6 billion to help Canadians prepare for and prevent the impacts of climate change. So we're continuing to roll out some of that money while we think about additional and new potential policies and programs.
Mrs. McDermott. Monsieur Bonnet, la parole est à vous pour 2.5 minutes. Merci.
Mr. Bonnet, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to come back to my question, which is quite simple. With the current plan, given the government steps backwards, what percentage of the 2030 target will we be able to reach? We are just now revising our projections with the most recent information so that we can answer this question directly. The work is ongoing, and we hope that we'll have the new projections. We'll have them before the update, which is due in December. So if you don't look at what Mr. Carney's done recently, what are the latest percentages? Well, we will look at those decisions, yes, but without those latest decisions, the latest figures. I can give you the figures that were published last December, December 2024. And this was in the biannual transparency report, and it showed that with all of the measures in place and announced, Canada should reduce its emissions by 34% compared to 2005 levels by 2030, and by 40% by 2035. So that included the regulation on cap on oil emissions that was not adopted. Yes. So if the measure was abolished, and there is a motion by the Conservatives to abolish the cap, how would that affect the figures? Well, we're trying to do those projections, but for that measure, well, we haven't completed the work yet, and it also depends on other measures that are put in place. There are many other measures that exist in the plan, but the regulation that did not pass, what would that have done for the figures? Well, what was presented in 2023, there was a projection for a 13 megaton contribution between 2030 and 2032. But there were many comments from various parties, and so we are revising the pathway that we should take. Thank you, Ms. Nichols. Mr. Leslie?
5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to start by asking, over the last decade, ECCC has been tasked with rolling out what are deeply unpopular policies, such as the consumer carbon tax that Canadians obviously despise, that has since been removed, Bill C-69, that has scared away private investment, still continues to scare away private investment and make it impossible to get anything built in this country. An oil and gas emissions cap proposal that is under review that may be moved, an EV mandate that was in place for next year that is paused and currently under review, emissions targets that the government is backing away from. So my question to the department is, after years of implementing these policies and now just to see them repealed by yet the same Liberal government, how is morale inside the department?
Maybe I can go, but should I turn to my colleague? I'll just say that the department feels like it has an important in a world where we have an administration in the U.S. that is not particularly committed to fighting climate change. We think that the work of the department is as important as ever, and the morale, although challenged by some of these developments and the fact that fiscal situation of the government is tight, I think the morale still remains good.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, the Liberal government has been quite firm in imposing an emissions cap on Canada's energy sector, which is actually just a production cap. I know it's not in place yet, but can you confirm whether or not that is still the government's plan, or is it quietly going to be shelved?
I don't think we can comment on the future plans of the government at this point in time.
Why not? Are you not involved in those conversations?
That's not something that we would share with the committee at this point.
Would you say that the policy is an important part of the government's plan to reduce emissions? I understand you've gotten rid of a number of these other policies. If that is shelved, is that going to have a major impact on the targets that the minister has already walked back from, the 2030 and 2035 targets? Is that going to further diminish the likelihood of meeting the government's own obligations under the Net Zero Accountability Act?
The oil and gas emissions cap is certainly a potential element of a way to reduce emissions from our highest emitting sector in the economy. But we do have other measures in place and planned as well, such as regulations on oil and gas, methane, carbon pricing, as well as incentives such as in investment tax credits. So in terms of the role of the potential oil and gas emissions cap, it was projected based on the draft that was presented in 2023 to contribute an additional 13 megatons of reductions between 2030 and 2032. But as I have said, we have received extensive feedback, and so that is being considered in light of the potential way forward.
So you mentioned projections, pardon me. If the cap is imposed, I'm sure the department has done modeling on the economic impact, particularly on jobs and investment. Could you share some highlights with us today and or provide written feedback as to what that modeling looks like?
I can share that in the draft that was presented in previously, that it was considered to have very minimal impact on growth of the sector, that growth of the sector would still increase by 16%. And in terms of GDP growth, extremely minimal impact. GDP was expected to still grow over the period by 22%. So very minimal impact.
Thank you. If you could please share that, and if there have been any revisions since 2023, would be appreciated. Are you aware that Minister Abruzin has publicly walked back the government's 2030 and 2035 emissions target obligations?
Not aware that she has. I don't believe she has walked those back.
She certainly has not committed to them. Does the department have any recent information or modeling that suggests Canada is on track to meet the targets of 2030 or 2035? Or is it just an open secret now that the government will not be hitting those targets?
Well, as I responded to Representative Bonin, if you look at our projections as of last December, there was some gap. And of course, this is a question to some degree where we will end up is a question to some degree of government policy intention. And the Prime Minister has announced that the government will be releasing a climate competitiveness strategy in the near term. So there'll be more information there on the government's policies.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie. Je passe la parole maintenant à Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
And now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Saint-Pierre for 5 minutes.
My colleagues. So I think language matters, and being precise is actually important. Call me a lawyer, but very stickler with precise language. There's some out there that like misinformation and disinformation, but I think facts and science and data matters. Some that are calling it a production cap on oil and gas. Is the policy called a production cap, or is it called an emissions cap? And what's the difference between the two? So in other words, why is it called an emissions cap and not a productions cap?
Indeed, just to confirm, it is an emissions cap and not a production cap.
Could you explain the difference between the two?
An emissions cap essentially sets a limit on the number of emissions that the sector can produce, recognizing that there are many opportunities to reduce emissions intensity. So by benefiting from reductions in emissions intensity, there is not necessarily a commensurate impact on production.
Mr. Fanjoy.
Canadians they want to know how they can participate in cleaning their sources of energy. We currently do not have at the federal level many incentives for them to get involved. Can we anticipate that the government will be engaging in Canadians across the country in roles that they can help Canada meet its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gases?
Yes, well, as we've discussed, the government does have quite a broad suite of policies and programs. Some that have been particularly consumer focused in recent years have included consumer incentives for electric vehicles, the oil to heat pump program, retrofit programs for housing. And so those, and as mentioned, a number of programs at the municipal and at the provincial level to support Canadians' participation in these kinds of activities. So we hope to be able to announce more details of programs in the future, but there's still a number of programs that are rolling out based on previous announcements.
Okay. I'm wondering, I know the Canadian Climate Institute has done a fair amount of work, in support of government's initiatives around climate action, about the cost of inaction. And, there a lot of times people talk about short-term costs, but we're not thinking about long-term costs. And we see the billions of dollars of losses in extreme weather events in our country. Our country's been on fire these past summers. I'm wondering, is that the work that you rely on as a department, or do you have other work that you could share around, the business case for strong climate policy in Canada?
Sure, yes. There's I think when we talk about economic trade-offs with respect to climate change, they tend to be those more on the very short term, because over the long term, the economic costs of climate change are in the billions of dollars, if not the trillions of dollars. And I think there's kind of a widespread belief that those costs are very high. So we'd be happy to share some more. That's very much a part of the thinking with respect to government policy, and we'd be happy to provide more details. There's been a number of estimates from the Canadian Climate Institute, the Parliamentary Budget Office, so there's a lot of third-party sources of such analysis as well.
Si vous me permettez, j'ai toujours un peu de temps.
Do I still have time? About 40 seconds. I'll be brief.
What's anticipated for Canada and COP30 that's coming up in Brazil? Est-ce que vous pouvez commenter sur le rôle du Canada à la COP30 au Brésil?
Can you comment on Canada's role in Brazil?
Hosting COP30, as you said, we anticipate this will be very much an implementation year. So many countries like Canada are being asked and expected to put forward new nationally determined contributions. So the new targets that you've been talking about, Canada was among the first countries to put those targets out and the plan in February. Other countries are coming to the table to do the same, and we anticipate this will be very much a conversation among leaders, among ministers and senior negotiators around how to move forward from here and address the gaps that many countries face, that the world faces, in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's much work to do. There will also be a great deal of conversation, I think, around financing and capacity to deliver, and how countries can support the investments in the clean transitions abroad and in countries that are working very hard to move away from fossil fuels and more traditional energy sources to achieve their own climate objectives.
Thank you, Mr. Bosnar. And I forward now the mic to Mr. Ross for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I was shocked when LNG Canada Phase 2 got recommended for fast tracking. I had no idea they had permits or authorizations outstanding within your departments. Can you tell me what outstanding permits or authorizations within your departments still needed approval or disapproval?
I don't believe there are any in our department.
So there was no permits or authorizations needed for LNG Canada Phase 2?
There are no outstanding ones. I would have to confirm if there were others that were already granted, but none that are outstanding from our department at this time.
To your understanding, then, is what needs to be fast-tracked? If there's no government permits or authorizations needed, what will be fast-tracked?
I would defer to the Major Projects Office on the actual benefits of fast-tracking this project, but sometimes there can be other barriers, be they funding or other requirements before.
No, not talk about exterior conditions. I'm talking about your departments in terms of what you need to do to authorize phase 2 for LNG Canada.
Again, there is nothing outstanding for Environment and Climate Change Canada on this project.
Okay. That's a surprise. A nice re-announcement there. You said there's currently no emissions cap, but there's some outstanding projects within the Impact Assessment Act for Canada. In particular, there's First Nations that want to use natural gas to produce electricity in energy deficient areas. Is there any reason from your departments why these approvals or disapprovals are not forthcoming in a timely manner?
I'm not aware of specific projects. Sometimes projects require provincial approval, so there could be that there's a provincial approval that is outstanding, but I'm not aware of specific ECCC permits required on these ones. However, we can certainly go and just validate and return to the committee with that information.
Okay, that'd be great because it's listed on your website for the impact assessment site, but doesn't really clearly describe a provincial jurisdiction areas. Is your department aware of a company called Edison Motors out of British Columbia? No? Okay. I was in MLA previously, and they were being kind of given the cold shoulder in terms of their business development idea. That was actually off and running with a great degree of success, but they did not have the government support. And now they've got some federal programs that are not providing them any support. And they've been approaching not only my office, but a number of different MPs' offices all across Canada trying to get government support. And it seems to fall under the environmental standards or the regulations or the legislation that restricts the government from supporting this Born in BC initiative. Can I ask you to actually look into this and get back to the committee with a written reason why this company is not getting the support of the federal government?
Certainly, we can look into this and come back to the committee.
Thank you. Another one I'd like to ask about is Sandspit Hotel in Sandspit on Haida Gwaii. I don't expect you to understand, but I did look at your job descriptions, and I did see real property is one of your jurisdictions. You're aware?
No, I'm not aware.
No. Okay. Well, it's an old hotel in Sandspit. It's a very decrepit, abandoned hotel, but it's government property, federal government property. And for years, this developer has been trying to say that he wants to acquire the property from the federal government and turn it into low-income and senior housing, and hasn't gotten a response. With the housing crisis that we have in Canada, as well as affordability, as well as our senior issues, I just want to know why the government is actually just ignoring the developer. Is there a reason? Because it's not only in terms of affordability or senior citizens. As this place rots, it's going to become an environmental issue.
Thank you. Short answer, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I can tell you that this is not a Crown asset that is managed by Environment Canada. So I will encourage you to ask your question to Public Services, PSPC. Sorry about the acronym, but Public Services should be in a position to tell you exactly who owns that property, and this could help, moving forward with next steps.
Merci, Madame Drainville. Mr. Bruce Fanjoy, please, for 5 minutes.
We're all looking forward to the release of the climate competitiveness strategy. Are you able to share with the committee some of the principles upon which that will be based?
At a very high level, I can say that this climate competitiveness strategy is about realizing climate goals in a manner that enhances Canada's long-term competitive position. And it very much is part of Canada's commitment to fight climate change and position Canada to lead in a global economy that is increasingly looking for decarbonized goods and services and technology and know-how. So the government is still developing this strategy, so I can't provide a whole lot of additional detail at this time.
Oui, les règlements sur la méthane ont été...
The regulation on methane were shown to be very efficient.
Were deemed to be fairly cost-effective climate abatement policy. Can you comment on whether the methane regulations work will be advancing to get to 75% reduction, ou est-ce que vous pouvez commenter sur si le règlement sur la méthane va s'allonger jusqu'à réduire les émissions à 60%?
Can you comment on whether this will be extended to reduce emissions to 75%?
Oil and gas methane have already achieved 40 to 45% reductions of methane from the sector, so have achieved their goal. And about 2 years ago, we put in place draft regulations. We proposed them to increase that to around 75%. And we've been working since then to take stock of input and feedback from stakeholders in provinces and territories to work towards a final regulation. And that work is still ongoing and hopefully will be completed soon.
I'm wondering about the status of the federal implementation of Bill C-226 on environmental justice and racism. It's a huge issue in my province of Nova Scotia. Is ECCC actively working with provinces and territories on implementing this now that it's received royal assent?
Yes, I can say that the department is, after a bit of a pause during the prorogation and the election campaign, is back to engaging with communities and with provinces and territories and Canadians on how to develop that strategy. And I think the timing as set out in the legislation requires a strategy in 2026. So I would say the government is on track to be in a position to release that strategy during that time frame.
Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
Merci. Et puis, est-ce que vous avez une mise à jour
Mr. Saint-Pierre, thank you. Do you have an update on the work that was done on taxonomy?
Taxonomy, and I think it was paused because of prorogation. Can you comment on what's upcoming for green taxonomy or taxonomy generally speaking?
Yes. Sorry, I do have some notes on the taxonomy. The taxonomy is an important part of the kind of sustainable finance piece of the government's climate plan, and this is really about mobilizing private sector capital, because to get to net zero by 2050, the government does not have enough financing on its own to do that. The private sector is very much going to be required. So the Government of Canada is very much committed to fostering the development of an overall sustainable finance market to try to support that kind of investment and drive economic growth and help fight climate change. In October 2024, the previous incarnation of the government announced a plan to deliver sustainable investment guidelines, or the taxonomy, to help mobilize the private sector capital towards activities essential to building a net zero economy. And as you may recall, this was in response to the Sustainable Finance Action Council's advice, which supported the idea of having an arm's length and external to government body or group develop a voluntary green and transition finance taxonomy.
Thank you, Mrs. McDermott. Time's up. Monsieur Lemire, bienvenue. La parole est à vous.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Lemire, welcome. The floor is yours. 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I'm happy to see you again. I hope your family is well. My question for the officials. We're in a strange context, and I'd like to know the impact of a prime minister like Mark Carney, where he is asking you to cut your spending, but also in the context of passing C5, which passed and has a major impact on environmental issues. So there's a group of people that can get together and say there's a series of laws that can be struck down, things that have to do with the marine mammals or migratory birds, etc. So what is the effect that this bill passing will have on your work?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Obligations under the Species at Risk Act, the Migratory Bird Convention Act, do not change. So we will be required under both of those acts to continue to do the analysis and assessments that we currently do. What C5 does is it, as my colleague Megan Nichols has spoken to previously, it focuses on the question of how. And I will turn it to Megan if there's anything that she would like to add to that. But just I do want to reiterate that our regulatory obligations under both of those acts have not changed.
Je peux ajouter que, comme déjà mentionné,
I can add that there will be a document with conditions will be created for every project, and the minister will be responsible for making recommendations. I think she intends to do so in line with the requirements that are in the acts that fall under our purview. It will also be up to us to ensure that all the conditions are met. Mr. Lemire, you have a little time left. What is the effect of the budgetary constraints that have been announced on your work? Thank you for your question. For the moment, we feel that we have enough money to deliver our mandate for Canadians. And so for the moment, everything is going fine. Thank you.
The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to lean into this emissions cap, production cap again, just because it's so important to the financial component of our province. So the Prime Minister is traveling the country. He's meeting with premiers. He's having conversations about our country being an energy superpower. And it's within that conversation that they're talking about walking this emissions cap back. So if it didn't have an impact on production, then why is the government reconsidering this policy?
I don't know that I can speak to sort of all the factors at play at the political level, but I would just say again that there are always a suite of measures at our disposal in terms of how to best reduce emissions from a particular sector, ranging from regulatory to incentives to direct funding. And, there's always opportunity to recalibrate the right balance in order to, protect competitiveness and job growth.
I've spent quite a bit of time talking to proponents in this industry, including Oilco, which is the provincial crown corporation responsible for managing Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas. They've actually called the federal emissions cap an investment killer because it's creating uncertainty in investment in that industry. There's a high level of upfront capital cost to this industry. And so I'm just curious, what's your response to that?
Again, I can really only go back to the draft regulations that were tabled and the assessment that was done at that time of the costs and impacts, as well as the benefits. And at that time, the impact on growth of the sector was assessed to be very minimal. and similarly on GDP growth. But again, we did receive significant feedback, all of which we are taking into account. That also includes additional information and data from industry that will help us to make sure our policies are fit for purpose and in line with the government's priorities.
So, but you're talking about it with respect to growth. So wouldn't that sort of really be, within the same conversation as production? Like, doesn't that go together? Like, wouldn't there be an acknowledgement that there's, if we don't have growth, we don't have production? So I just think it's, how do you square that? How do you speak about it from a growth perspective, but then say it's not a production cap?
I'm not sure if I'm fully following. The assessed impact on growth, like I say, was very minimal. So again, minimal impact on production. The projected growth without the draft cap, as proposed initially, was 17%, and with the cap was assessed to be 16%. So extremely minimal impact.
So specifically within the sector, though, in Newfoundland and Labrador, they're saying that they're not getting growth or investment. So where do they play within that conversation then? I'm curious.
I would have to come back to the committee with more details on the specific impacts on the offshore sector, which we can certainly do in a follow-up.
Yeah, that would be great if you could provide us with some more information, because all the meetings that I've had and the discussions that have come through, I'm getting a completely different response from the industry. So I would really appreciate that. I just want to shift gears just a little bit. None of these offshore projects are on the national projects list. And, we've talked about Canada being an energy superpower, its strategic location to tidewater, and our diversification of trade. So I'm just wondering if, what concrete measures the government is putting in place if they aren't on this national projects list. How do we move some of these projects forward?
I think our colleagues at NRCan would be better placed to talk about steps that the government and actions the government is taking to promote these types of projects. I would just remind that there is no projects list that's been scheduled at this point. There's a prospective list that's being examined and considered to be scheduled.
Okay. And I guess one last thing, in terms of the emissions cap, is there a timeline around when some decisions might be made on this? Because this is something that's super important.
Understood. And unfortunately, it's not within my purview to know what that time would be.
Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
And now the floor goes to Mr. Saint-Pierre for 5 minutes. I will give my time to Mr. Wade.
I apologize. I'm a bit under the weather. But I'm from an urban First Nation, but I know that we've done a lot of work with different partners about conservation and the effects of climate change. I was just wondering what you could share about the engagement and learning from First Nations and Inuit and Métis about conservation and how that could benefit us in the future. Sorry.
Thank you for the question. So we have a number of partnerships with Indigenous nations across Canada. This includes, and we have distinctions-based nature tables with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. In addition, our programming includes programming like the Indigenous Guardians Initiative. We have entered into a number of innovative agreements focused on conservation, including most recently the Project Finance for Permanence initiatives in both the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut, along with a recent initiative in the Great Bear Sea in British Columbia. Those leverage private philanthropic money to match investments made by the Government of Canada and PT governments. There are more I could speak to, but I think those are the top line partnerships that I would highlight in the conservation space.
So I'm curious, how many megatons is Canada producing annually? And what percentage of Canada's total emissions is coming from the oil and gas sector? And second question related to that, can you quickly comment on which sectors in Canada are reducing emissions and which sectors where emissions are actually increasing?
So I can, our estimate would be that the largest source of emissions is from the oil and gas sector at 30%. And other important sectors contributing emissions would be the transport sector at 22% and buildings at 13%.
And are you aware if the emissions for the oil and gas sector are increasing or decreasing?
The production for the oil and gas sector is increasing, and thus the absolute emissions are as well, although some efforts have been made too. Some success has been had in reducing the emissions intensity of the oil and gas sector.
Thank you.
It's come up the question of dealing with our challenges, climate change and environmental responsibilities, in the context of the need to find savings in our budget. I think just want to make clear that there's nothing more unaffordable than unmitigated climate change. So perhaps if you could expand upon the cost of pollution and the cost of climate change to the Canadian economy.
Yeah, well, apologies. I will. We will have some more of our own numbers, I think, for you, but I can give you a third-party figure. For example, the Insurance Bureau of Canada says that extreme weather caused an estimated $9.2 billion in insured losses last year alone. That actually made 2024 the most destructive year in Canadian history. So as I mentioned, we do have some other estimates that we could compile from our own analysis as well as those of third parties, but that's a good measure of damage, at least insured losses last year.
Short question.
Just to follow up on that, so that's extreme weather events. What about the economic cost of pollution? Like, do you have any numbers around, impacts to health from air quality, things like that? We know that the oil and gas industry in Canada is committed to a path to net zero by 2050, and there are lots of ways we're going to get there. But does some of that information drive our decision making now?
Yeah, absolutely. The air quality considerations are like an additional factor that brings benefits when we reduce climate change impacts, or when we reduce pollution.
Thank you. And now the floor goes to Mr. Leslie for 5 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to pick up on a piece of testimony that came out there that the carbon tax had a limited effect of 1% to 2%. In 2024, the Canadian Climate Institute released a report saying that the consumer carbon tax was 8 to 9%. And I listened to Liberal politicians use that stat as a defense of why they couldn't possibly get rid of the consumer carbon tax. So now that the political winds have changed, why is it that the department is using such drastically different numbers of the importance of the consumer carbon tax in terms of emissions reductions?
Sorry, I probably wasn't as strong in my French language when I answered that question. The 1 to 2% was talking about the impact on our reductions vis-a-vis our 2005 levels. So I think the 8% that you heard estimated by the Climate Institute would be the share of overall emissions reductions accounted for by that consumer fuel charge.
I would just like to move on to the Major Projects Office. Do any of the 5 projects that have been referred to the Major Projects Office thus far require a federal permit through ECCC?
Yes, the Contrecoeur project would require a Species at Risk Act permit.
Now, how are you expecting folks, project proponents, to go and get on this list? Will they be lobbying ECCC, natural resources bureaucracies, or either of your ministers, or will they just be going straight to the Prime Minister to lobby to get on this designated list?
Do you want to take it? Or?
Yes,
We're
I
still
think.
waiting to find out who gets lobbied.
Indeed, projects can be identified in a number of different ways through discussions between ministers and provinces and territories or stakeholders, through discussions with the Major Projects Office. So there's no, one prescribed pathway in order to make sure that key projects are identified in as robust a way possible.
How do Canadians have any confidence that this won't be used to either select pet projects that are of interest to Liberal insiders or to block projects that simply are not liked politically?
The legislation, the Building Canada Act, does lay out certain principles that the government can consider in identifying projects. And these are things that will be considered, such as clean growth impacts of potential projects, their capacity to facilitate trade and economic growth. So those are laid out in the legislation itself. And then through...
Okay, thank you. That's okay. I'd just like to move on to one of those particular projects. The Prime Minister has indicated that the Port of Churchill might be one of the designated projects of natural interest. Are you aware that the Western Premiers have already signed an MOU to develop an economic corridor to Hudson's Bay?
I think the answer at the table is no.
It came out of the Western Premiers meeting just a couple of months ago. I would encourage the department to look at that. Now, at the very same time, Parks Canada is looking to create multiple marine conservation areas within Hudson's Bay. Can you explain to me why one arm of the government is trying to encourage new projects while another arm, in this case Parks Canada, is trying to block entire areas of water in which a project like this could have never actually come to fruition?
So I can't speak to Parks Canada's plans for the creation of national marine conservation areas in that region. I would suggest, though, that at times I don't know what their plans are, but there are scenarios where activities are still permitted in conservation areas, but we can't speak to specifics without understanding the specific situation at hand.
Mr. Leslie, 1 minute left, please.
Thank you, sir. Could you confidently say that if there is an imposition of restrictions, that it will not get in the way of moving energy, critical minerals, or other goods through the Port of Churchill? Can we say that confidently today?
Not being responsible for the initiative at hand, I don't feel that I can comment on it.
Okay. Now, just quickly touching on the EV mandates, there obviously has been a pause and a review ongoing. In terms of those particular mandates, when was the decision made to pause, and what is the status of the report, of the review, I should say?
Short answer, please.
The announcement to pause was made just a couple of weeks ago. And in terms of the 60-day review, it kicked off on that same day and is currently underway, having many discussions with industry and provinces, territories, and other stakeholders.
Monsieur Saint-Pierre, la parole est à vous pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Saint-Pierre, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you. I'll be sharing my time with my colleagues.
Markets Bureau, and curious about where carbon border adjustment mechanisms might fall within some of your work. So I'm not sure exactly who I should be addressing this question to, but we know that Europe is moving towards carbon border adjustment mechanism, and so I'm curious where ECCC is falling on some of this work, and if you can maybe comment on whether CBAM will become a part of ECCC's mandate in the coming months or the coming years. Merci.
So note that initiative is under the responsibility of the Department of Finance, but the department continues both at the international level and the Carbon Markets Bureau. We do follow those developments and are contributing to the work that's being done in studying those measures in other countries.
J'aurais peut-être une question sur le charbon.
I have a question on coal. Can you comment on Canada's contribution in terms of public policies that target coal and how it's contributed to the world in general?
The coal industry or the coal sector?
Certainly, in terms of thermal coal, Canada has in place regulations to phase out the use of unabated coal for electricity by December 31st, 2029. So those regulations remain in place. I do think it's important to just distinguish between thermal and metallurgical coal, which of course Canada continues to be a producer of metallurgical coal in many provinces. We are also members of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is an international alliance dedicated to phasing out the use of unabated coal for electricity internationally.
If Canada was to abandon its industrial carbon tax, what would that mean about for attracting investment into Canada? Carbon pricing, sorry.
Well, indeed, as we're seeing the global economy pivot more and more to net zero and to being low carbon, we do consider it's an important part of attracting investment. Our most recently modeling shows that the industrial carbon price will bring between 52, 57 megatons of reductions in our GHG emissions in 2030, so quite a sizable amount. And also there are a number of studies from third parties that demonstrate the significant billions of dollars of investment related to the carbon price across Canada. I believe one of the numbers from the Canadian Climate Institute is that there are about 70 major decarbonization projects in place across the country, valued at about $57 billion, that are benefiting from either credits from carbon pricing or from deferred compliance costs.
I'm just wondering if ECCC has any role in supporting climate resiliency for Indigenous housing. I know the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Organization is here this week. I'm going to be meeting with them. I'm wondering if there's a division across departments or not on something like that.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure with respect to that specific initiative, but I would note that Environment Canada plays a role more broadly in supporting departments in their policy development. And so we have a group that inside Environment Canada that does supports other departments in policy capacity building with respect to both adaptation and mitigation. And we also help support the consideration of climate and adaptation considerations in all policies and proposals put forward through a lens called the Climate, Nature, and Economy lens, which requires that when new policies are put forward or being developed, departments need to consider these factors. And again, there's support given to those departments. So I wouldn't be surprised at technical levels if those kinds of supports were being offered. But when departments have big initiatives like Housing and Infrastructure Canada, they generally will have some of their own staff develop that kind of expertise. For example, in adaptation, that's extremely important that investments being made today are going to be robust and kind of able to withstand the climate that we're expecting in the future. So that's
Thank you, Mrs. McDermott. Time is up. Monsieur Lemire, à vous la parole pour 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Lemire, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. You know, I come from Abitibi-Témiscamingue, which is a mining area, and social acceptability is an important issue. And during the years of mining development, there wasn't enough regulation, and the province of Quebec has corrected that. So, if I understand correctly, a group of buddies at the federal level will decide which programs, which projects to put forward. I believe Quebec should play a role in protecting the environment. So, what can we do as Canadian citizens to make sure that environmental laws are respected? Now, just to be clear, I do think that mining is part of the solution, mining for critical minerals, but obviously we mustn't do so to the detriment of the law. So if I understand correctly, it's possible now to go around provincial and federal legislation. Is that correct? I can give you a few comments based on my own observations of the new law. I would say that the law falls under the responsibility of the Privy Council. What I can say, however, is that before a project is approved under this new law, there is a requirement to consult provinces, including Quebec, of course, and they might have to consult with the BAP also. It depends on the process. They will also have to consult Indigenous peoples. When it comes to Indigenous groups, I'm very proud because it was here that the Bloc, supported by the Conservatives, were able to improve the law by removing Indigenous groups from the annex. But I think I've run out of time. Thank you.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Can you tell me, on average, given the engagement with the First Nations and provincial entities, how long does it take to acquire a federal environmental certificate for a linear major project? Just on average.
I believe that question would probably be more appropriate for the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, so I would defer to them.
Okay, and it was mentioned that with these new regulations and legislation, that the climate for investment is going to be huge, and you've got evidence to back that up. But our competitors, our major competitors, China, United States, Russia, have no carbon tax, and they have no emissions cap. And they're doing more with their oil and gas production as opposed to Canada, which has stalled. No new projects have been approved, so the economy is not going to improve. Has there been analysis done to study the competitiveness between Canada and our major competitors, namely Russia, United States, and China?
I would say there are, in general, international comparisons and consideration of competitiveness issues informs all the advice that is provided. So yes, implicitly, those kinds of factors are taken into account. And I think each of those countries has sort of unique factors and circumstances in terms of how their climate policies are set. But there's been actually quite a bit of action on the part of some of these other countries as well.
I understand that, but the talk around China's emissions doesn't relate to oil and gas. The United States has no oil and gas cap. They got no carbon tax. Same with Russia. They're doing great. And whether or not you're talking about primary markets or secondary markets, their production is actually increasing, including all the coal plants that are being built in China. So I heard the conversation around coal as well. But the specific question was, is there an analysis done within your departments or government for that matter that talks about the competitiveness of the oil and gas or even the coal industry in relation to these three major competitors?
As Alison had mentioned, it's not a specific study per se, but we factor that kind of analysis into all the work and all the advice that we give government, be it China, India, Russia, the United States, all major economies. We look very hard at their trajectory. we look very hard at the emissions that they also produce. And from an Environment Canada perspective, when we engage internationally, it's around what elements of their plan, of their objective, is around emissions reduction over time and energy transition as well. So where are they also making those commitments in energy?
You're talking about specific data. Is that for public consumption? Is that on your websites?
I'd have to check the website as to what specific data is there. I'm talking about analysis and advice that is provided to ministers.
I understand the advice side and the recommendation side, but is that transparent? There's no way to hold government accountable unless that kind of information is transparent. Is that information there for public consumption?
A lot of the information would be available. There's also a lot of the advice with respect to an analysis with respect to the oil and gas.
Can we get an example of that? Can we get an example of that?
From our colleagues at Natural Resources Canada.
Mrs. McDermott, 1 second, please, Mr. Ross. Ask a question to the witnesses. Give them time to respond. You can't just jump into another question, because translation will have difficulty in following.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And really, I'm trying to get a specific answer to a specific question. Can I ask the question again?
Sure.
Can we get an example of that information in terms of the recommendation or advice to government that talks about competitive analysis with a country like China, United States, or Russia in terms of competitiveness?
I'll just note that China is the highest emitter of GHG emissions in the entire world. Russia is number 4.
So, yeah, that's not the question. You talked about a recommendation or advice to government in terms of competitiveness and analysis of other policies coming from our competitive countries. I'm asking, is there an example of that so we can be transparent and hold government accountable in terms of competitiveness and Canada becoming an energy superpower?
Yeah, and as I said, a lot of the advice and analysis being on the oil and gas sector would be performed at Natural Resources Canada. But I will note, as I have earlier, that the government is planning to release a climate competitiveness strategy, which very much gets at many of those same issues. So hopefully that will help satisfy some of that interest on your part.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned there's no authorization or permits needed for LNG Canada Phase 2. There are 4 other projects listed in the Major Projects Office, nuclear and other projects. And I don't expect you to provide me an answer right now, but can you list the authorizations and permits needed from the federal government for the remaining 4 projects listed within the Major Projects Office? Because I assume these projects initiated through your departments.
A very brief answer.
I think we can get the committee a list. I will just, earlier I had mentioned that the Conchacur project will require a Species at Risk Act permit.
Thank you, Mrs. Shannon. Thank you, Mr. Ross. And à vous, Monsieur Saint-Pierre, pour 5 minutes.
Parfait, merci.
Thank you.
Canadian Climate Institute, which you're familiar with, has identified 4 key policies that would drive decarbonization. So 1 is strengthening the industrial carbon price. 2 is finalizing the methane regs for oil and gas sector. 3rd is finalizing clean electricity investment tax credits, or ITCs. And the 4th is, as I mentioned previously, the Made in Canada climate taxonomy. I'm just curious if CCI or the Canadian Climate Institute's recommendations have been taken into consideration, and if you can comment on that, would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, no, they very much are of interest to the department, and they will be feeding into the government's, as I say, forthcoming climate competitiveness strategy and its decision making on all of these pieces.
Can you talk a little bit about the risks that Canada would face if it weakened its climate ambition, competitiveness, leadership, while trading partners and other major players across the globe are strengthening theirs?
Yeah, I think from an economic standpoint, that is, in fact, the major factor driving the Prime Minister's suggestion, in fact, instruction to create a climate competitiveness strategy. It's the recognition that the the global trends are very much in the direction of low carbon, and that although there's a bit of a setback right now with respect to the U.S. administration's policy, other countries are speeding towards a low carbon economy, and if Canada does not think about that and take that into account in developing its own policies, we could find ourselves, and our companies could find themselves far behind, as we may expect some shifts over time in even in U.S. policy. But even without that, we find economic trends in terms of costs and the cost of renewables going down, and the demand for low carbon projects and products and services growing significantly over time. So the idea of getting Canadian firms and businesses and individuals aligned with where those global trends are going is very much at the heart of the climate competitiveness strategy and the policies of this government.
When we look at different forms of energy, conventional energy, solar, wind, nuclear, can you tell us which is the lowest cost form of energy?
It's actually challenging to keep up with the developments and cost curves. I think it very much depends on which types of installations, but we know that the price of solar is very competitive right now, solar, wind, and batteries in general, depending on the circumstance and the specific location. One may be more suitable than the other and more cost effective than the other, but those are becoming very quickly the cheapest and most cost effective forms of energy.
Je suis député du Québec où on est très chanceux.
I am a member for a province for Quebec, and we are very lucky. We have Hydro-Quebec, which provides renewable energy.
Grid system. Est-ce que vous pouvez commenter sur la décarbonisation des systèmes d'électricité dans d'autres provinces?
Can you comment on
Carbonize other electricity grids throughout the country?
Well, I would say across the government there are a few different things that we're doing to encourage net zero electricity. NRCan has made a lot of investments and continues to provide significant funding. In terms of Environment Canada, we just recently published the Clean Electricity Regulations, which will achieve a net zero grid across the country by 2050. And that brings at least an additional 181 megatons of reduction to our GHGs by 2050, as well as at the same time providing an important foundation to attract clean growth and more investment into our economy.
Thank you, Mrs. Nichols. Mrs. Asti, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We've just gotten reports that Prime Minister Carney just gave a speech saying that China is very sincere on the climate and have a standing offer to engage. And I'm just curious if your committee has any evidence of that in your communications with them.
Perhaps I can take that question. And I have not seen Prime Minister's speech this morning. But what I can say is China is very active in the world of the UNFCCC, so the United Nations, the multilateral system that drives much of the decision, the normative framework around climate action and drives the Paris Agreement in many ways as well. We engage bilaterally with China on issues around environment and climate change as well, in part to push them and increase their level of ambition and ensure that they are telling the whole story, not just the story that is convenient for the country itself. But they do continue to engage internationally, and they do continue to be seen as a significant player in the international climate world.
I just wanted to clarify because it's interesting within the context of some of the other figures and numbers that were talked about earlier in our meeting. I just want to pivot for a minute. There was some conversation around extreme weather events, and in my province this summer, we certainly saw the devastation of wildfires across the province. But particularly in my riding, I have an area very similar to the situation in Jasper. There is a lot of dead wood in the forest as a result of the spruce budworm. And I know that the community has been actively engaging with stakeholders and volunteers and trying to come up with a plan to deal with this. I'm curious to know, based on the lessons that were learned in the Jasper wildfire, what actions the government is taking to mitigate a similar situation going forward.
I would just say that that question is probably best placed for our colleagues at Parks Canada, who are responsible for wildfire management in national parks. At Environment and Climate Change Canada, we don't have a direct responsibility for fire management, as we don't manage the lands.
So I'm curious, would we be able to get them to come to speak to this, or is there some way that we can engage on this issue, as it is a very big concern? And I think within the context of talking about extreme weather events, we can't really pick and choose the ones that we want to talk about. This is something that is very important. So just curious if we could put that out there and have them come at another time to speak to this.
I'm certain that the committee could make a request, and our colleagues would be pleased to come to present what they have done since the Jasper wildfires.
And I'll just note that the government does make some investments in kind of mitigation activities with respect to fire protection. So I know we have invested, CERNAC has invested in Indigenous communities, but there have been other investments through public safety and kind of fire smart type investments that help very much make a big difference in terms of the way communities are affected by wildfires.
Yeah, and I think the investment component is great, but when these people are driving through their communities and it looks like a tinderbox, it's causing a lot of fear and concern. So this would be super important to me. I just also wanted to pivot to something as well with respect to the EV mandates. And again, this is something that I get asked about a lot, and I know that there's a pause in place. One of the things that I often get where I live in my part of the world, long distances between charging stations, extreme weather conditions, and typically what's happening in terms of the consumer demand is it's really diminished. And I'm just wondering, when you're looking at these policies, do you consider the challenges in rural Canada and the different impact that this has in these communities? Because these car dealers have all of these electric vehicles on their lots, an inability to move them, and the consumer demand just really isn't there. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to the rural-urban divide on electric vehicles, please.
Sorry, we're up for time. Monsieur Saint-Pierre.
Yes, maybe picking up on that. So I've been driving an electric car since 2018, and actually the range by EV goes further. I recently made a road trip from Montreal to Sudbury, Ontario, where I'm originally from, about 800 kilometers return, and there's available charging infrastructure. So my question might be around the EV subsidies. Can you comment on the effectiveness of the EV subsidies and whether it could return?
The EV subsidies, the federal ones, are a responsibility of Transport Canada, and so I would defer to them on what to expect going forward. But in terms of what we've seen for results, last year we did see sales of EVs up to over 15% across Canada, so a significant increase since before those subsidies were in place. This year, without those subsidies in place and also with some provincial incentives winding down, we have seen sales drop to about 9%. I do think it's important, though, to note there are other factors, too, that have likely driven that decline, such as we've seen upfront price parity not coming quite as quickly as we expected to. So that even with the incentives, there is still often a price differential. Then also the impact just of what's happening in the U.S. market for EVs with policies in the U.S., as well as the impact of tariffs is having a bit of an impact as well. So many different factors, which is why we are taking a pause to look at the current mandate that we have and make sure that it's fit for purpose. That being said, just important to note that as with many things, we do think, a suite of initiatives is important. So it's not just the mandate, it's not just incentives, it's also looking at charging infrastructure and making sure that there's a range of choices available to Canadians to meet their needs.
Great. And maybe a follow-up question. Can you comment on global sales of electric vehicles? Is it flatlining? Is it going down, or is it going up? And if you can refer to other countries, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. I think the most recent data we have is that about 1 in 4 vehicles sold globally is a zero-emission vehicle. I'm not too sure what the latest trend is, but I do think it's continuing to increase in areas where it's increasing more rapidly. The EU, Norway, and actually in China right now, I believe it's about 1 in 2 light-duty vehicles is an electric vehicle.
Just to expand on that, I just wanted to know what are the early indicators that global demand for low carbon products will grow, and how is Canada positioning itself for that?
Yeah, I mean, price is one of the big factors, and just in terms of an indicator or likelihood, like the Chinese electric vehicles have been the price has come down very dramatically, and they're extremely low cost. So for countries where they're being exported, the demand's quite high. But similar for other types of relevant clean economy products like batteries, the cost of batteries, the cost of solar panels continues to come down dramatically, and that, of course, makes the demand grow very strongly.
Any further question? Alors, je passe la parole à Monsieur.
In that case, I will give the floor to Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. On November 10th, 2023, your department's made a press release saying the government was going to invest up to $8 million to protect green spaces in the east of the city of Montreal. There were other investments that you made jointly with another department to plant 200,000 trees in the eastern part of Montreal. Now, I spoke to Mr. Guilbeault, the former Minister of the Environment, to find out if Rouyn-Noranda could also access this type of funding. Unfortunately, I was unable to get a clear answer. I'd like to know which criteria you used to say yes to this request in Montreal and no to my request for Rouyn-Noranda. Thank you for the question.
Familiar with both of the projects. I think we'd have to follow up with a written answer.
Est-ce qu'il serait possible pour vous de faire une vérification et me revenir par écrit, s'il vous plaît?
Could you verify that and come back to me in writing to let me know which criteria were looked at and which alternatives could be thought of? Because I think that it is urgent to act in Rouyn-Noranda also, and the federal government has not listened when it comes to these issues in my writing. Yes, we can respond in writing. Thank you. Thank you. Another thing that I wanted to raise, how can we make sure that we are protecting the environment in more southern regions? when you talk about building protected zones, usually it's not in the southern part of the country that is more densely populated. So there are huge swaths of land that are protected, but not in that area of the country. Now, understand me, I think it's very important to protect this land, but could there be a better distribution of this protected land and have more protected land in the southern part of the country? Thanks for the question.
Cost of protection is higher in the south than in the north. In the south of Canada, that is the area of the highest biodiversity value, so that is often an area where we put a lot of our attention. There are a number of factors that go into a decision to invest in potential protected areas. So there's not one set criteria. It's a factor analysis, including, and most importantly, the cooperation with stakeholders. We as a federal government are not, for the most part, owners of the land. So we cannot advance protected areas without the support and close collaboration of the implicated governments and stakeholders in a particular area.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. Mr. Lemire, votre temps est épuisé.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Your time is up.
This meeting, sorry, Mr. Leslie, if I attribute some time to you, I have to give it to everybody. I've been generous with everybody, and I've also been generous with the departments, giving them a little extra time to be able to complete their responses. So,
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Pardon?
Point of order.
Yes.
Just and unrelated to that, I appreciate the round requirements there. I'm just curious. There's been a lot of questions about Parks Canada. I know they've been somewhat hived off to a different department, but I'd be surprised if they're completely outside of ECCC. So I'm just curious if it might be worth adding them to the list for Thursday's meeting to be able to answer many of the questions that were offered here today.
So, unfortunately not, because Parks Canada has now been moved to Heritage. So this is why those questions are not being addressed.
So just to clarify, they have no involvement with ECCC anymore, or perhaps the department has an answer to that?
It's now under Heritage, yep. Would you like to say something, Mrs. Shannon? So, any other questions?
Juste question de clarification, Monsieur le Président. Vous nous dites
Just a question of clarification, Mr. Chair. You're saying that since Parks Canada is under Heritage now, they won't have to respond to any environmental issues, and the committee can't ask them any issues, any questions related to fundamental issues related to the environment? First of all, our committee can invite any party. It's up to you. But now Parks Canada falls under Canadian Heritage. But I believe the Conservative Party very clearly asked whether we could invite Parks Canada to the next meeting, and if that is a formal proposal, then I would second that. We already have 2 agencies appearing next week. You weren't there for the first meeting, but my goal was to have departments on Monday and Thursday, and your colleague put a lot of pressure on us to not do things that way. He wanted us to move into a study immediately, and as you can see, we will be having 2 other departments appearing next week. So I don't think we'll have enough time for Parks Canada, but if it's something that the committee wishes to do, it will happen at another date. And I will let the members of the committee decide whether they want to go ahead with that or not.
Next Thursday at 11 a.m., September 25th, 2025. We will receive further briefings from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and the Canada Water Agency. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting?
Yes.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, and I'd like to also thank all the officials for being present today. Thank you, and
Merci aux